These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.
Hello again, and thanks for joining us for this Saturday's show. Up first, hazardous weather graphics. There are still winter weather advisories out from the eastern Brooks Range southward into the central interior, Koyukuk Valley down in toward Tanana, eastward across the Fairbanks area, and for the Yukon Flats, Fort Yukon down into the upper Tanana Valley 40-mile country, as well as the eastern Alaska Range, and that's out for tonight through Sunday. And for satellite imagery, areas of snow falling over the eastern interior, some pretty gusty winds, anywhere from 25 to as high as 40 miles an hour in some locations, with several inches of snow falling over portions of the eastern interior. It's appeared to be heaviest up toward the eastern Alaska Range and into the eastern Copper River Basin areas, and cleared out over the Arctic coast today. And otherwise, not much change out west. Just some mid and high level clouds coming across south central Alaska today, making for a cloudier day than what we've seen for the last couple of days there. That extending into Prince William Sound, a little bit thicker clouds there, but no precipitation, dry. And a system bringing some rain up to the southern southeast coast today, upwards of a quarter of an inch or so falling across Prince of Wales Island in toward Ketchikan and Metlakatla, those areas in toward Misty Fjords with lighter amounts, and then it cuts off really not much at all up to the north, just some clouds. Then a much stronger system back out over the western Bering Sea there. That brought very gusty winds, storm force winds actually, to the western Aleutians today. And winds on the increase now over toward Adak, but pretty nice conditions, light winds and dry conditions for the eastern Bering Sea, Pribilof, St. Lawrence Island, right on down to the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. As you can see on the chart, those areas under the influence of a very strong area of high pressure, extending one center just south of Nikolsky, all the way up across the Russian Far East, and then the strongest center up north of the Arctic coast there in the Arctic Ocean. That strong high and the lower pressure south of Resurrection Bay, enough gradient there, kicking the winds up anywhere to 40 miles an hour to the northeast today at Fort Yukon. Fairbanks seeing gusts out of the northeast up to 35 miles an hour, and McGrath up to about 30 miles an hour today. So pretty windy conditions and colder air riding in on those northeast winds, with temperatures below freezing now over much of the area north of the Alaska Range and also out across the northern half of the state, actually. And out west, that storm system pushing wind and rain into the western Aleutians. Again, storm force winds with gusts to 67 miles per hour is recorded at Shemya during the afternoon today. And then another front, not quite as windy, bringing rain into the southern southeast coast. And for tonight, that front moves through, weekends actually, and a couple of bands of showers will be rotating north and northwestward along the Panhandle, keeping it unsettled there and cloudy, but less in the way of rainfall amounts will be a little lighter, but chances of precipitation extend all the way up into Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, westward to maybe Yakutat, and chance of some snow shower activity over the Kenai Peninsula and the mountainous terrain of the southeast interior, especially the Alaska Range, Wrangell Mountains, on up to the Yukon River over the east side, but stays dry and mostly clear over the western half of the state into the northern and eastern Bering Sea, again, including the Fox Islands. Winds with possible minimum gales come into the central Aleutians, mostly Adak tonight. And then for tomorrow, we'll see that front continues to weaken and slow its eastward progression, with ranges reaching Atka Island and maybe a few clouds reaching the eastern Aleutians, partly to mostly cloudy for the Pribilofs with light winds and still dry conditions there, and stays dry and mostly clearer over the eastern Bering all the way up into the Chukchi Sea and the Arctic there. And coming around the eastern side of that strong 1,052 millibar high north of Wainwright, weak disturbance could bring a little bit of moisture and some flurries and fog into the eastern Arctic coast, eastern Beaufort Sea coast there, and Mackenzie Bay and Delta areas, otherwise dry for the Brooks Range, and still a chance of snow over the eastern interior and along the Alaska Range, down in the Copper River Basin. Scattered rain and snow showers for the Kenai Peninsula, possibly, and kind of showery for the Panhandle as well. Looking ahead to the day Monday, still southwest flow, keeping it showery over the southeast coast. Good chance of showers anywhere across the Panhandle with lower flying conditions, especially in the morning hours, improving a little bit in the afternoon. Basically looking at marginal VFR at those times, or even some areas of IFR. And chances of snow continue from the eastern interior south of the Brooks Range all the way down into the Copper River Basin. Still a risk of some snow shower activity for the Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound area, into the Matanuska Valleys, western Copper River Basin, Talkeetna, and those areas. Otherwise, not much change over the interior or the northern Bering Sea. Seeing some moisture now work up to the Pribilof Islands and eastward with a new low center on the southern portion of that front, while the northern portion kind of elongates out and dissipates into a band of moisture from the Pribilofs off to the west-northwest, and showers diminishing over the Aleutians with pretty light wind conditions, although it looks pretty showery for the Fox Islands with maybe winds out of the west 15 to 30 miles per hour. And for the lows tonight, in the upper 30s to lower 40s for the southeast coast. Upper teens, Copper River Basin, lower 20s, Susitna Valley, otherwise 25 to 30 for the Kenai Peninsula. And in the teens, west of the Alaska Range, but Bristol Bay in the lower 20s, near 31 for Kodiak. Highs tomorrow. Upper 30s to lower 40s, south central Alaska. Upper 30s for the Copper River Basin, near 44 for Seward. And upper 40s to near 50 for the Panhandle, staying in the 20s west of the Alaska Range. And lows Monday morning, 10 to 15 for the Copper River Basin, and 5 to 10 in the Kuskokwim Valley, 15 to 20 for the Bristol Bay area. In the 20s, south central Alaska, as well as Kodiak Island. No change for the Panhandle, followed by highs 45 to 50 for the southeast coast, and in the 40s for the south central Alaska area. Upper 30s Copper River Basin, west of the Alaska Range, areas staying below freezing the entire day. Up to the north, lows single numbers through the Tanana Valley, otherwise below zero, 15 to 20 below for the Brooks Range Arctic coast out to the north slope out to the Arctic coast. And then highs tomorrow, teens and 20s, coldest from the Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast, of course, and in the mid-teens for the Seward Peninsula, except mid-20s for Nome, followed by lows 5 below to 10 above for the Seward Peninsula, below 0 from the northern valleys out to the Arctic coast, and 0 to 10 for the central interior, followed by highs well below freezing everywhere, in the 20s in the central interior, down to the Alaska Range, and single numbers for the Arctic coast. And lows tonight, mid-20s for the Pribilofs, mid to upper 30s for the Aleutians, and upper 20s, lower 30s for the Alaska Peninsula. Highs tomorrow in the 40s for the Aleutians, 30s to near 40 for the Alaska Peninsula, followed by lows 20s and 30s, and highs 35.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather. We've got some IFR there over the southeast interior of the state, mostly the northern Copper River Basin up toward the Alaska Range, marginal VFR down to the Coast Range, and some marginal VFR into the Kenai Peninsula and along the Alaska Range. VFR for most of the area of the western interior and then up along the Yukon River, all the way up into the southern Brooks Range, marginal VFR, eastern North Slope, and eastern Arctic coast. Then a band of IFR coming onto the southwest coast, mostly the Yukon Delta coast, Nunivak Island, extending from St. Lawrence Island down to the north shore of the Alaska Peninsula. And another band out there coming across the west central Aleutians, starting to slide in toward Adak, and the Panhandle, IFR, some marginal VFR. And for the afternoon, mostly marginal VFR now for the southeast coast, IFR just west of Yakutat, on up across the eastern border there, almost up to Eagle, with marginal VFR up to the Yukon River, and along the Alaska Range mountainous terrain of the Copper River Basin, eastern North Slope and Arctic coast, some marginal VFR. Otherwise, the remainder of the state back to VFR, Kodiak Island, Cook Inlet, or staying VFR out west there, all the way into the Bering Sea. A little bit of marginal VFR on the Alaska Peninsula, and that band of IFR now right over Adak and pushing in toward Atka Island. Then for Monday, that area expands and now extending from around Kiska Island eastward to just north of Unmak Island up to the Pribilofs. VFR to the northeast and east of that area, right into the interior. Mostly VFR over interior Alaska, south of the Brooks Range. Some lingering marginal VFR continues over the upper Tanana Valley, 40-mile country, eastern Alaska range. And a lot of IFR now for the eastern North Gulf coast there, Yakutat, all of the Panhandle. And then for the afternoon, that improves on Monday. Marginal VFR for the southeast coast, North Gulf coast, and areas of the Copper River Basin, eastern Alaska range, and lingering marginal VFR for the North Slope. Otherwise, a band of IFR now pushing eastward into the Alaska Peninsula, improving, but still a lot of marginal VFR for the Aleutians, IFR for the Pribilofs, VFR northern Bering Sea into the Arctic Ocean. And for passes Anatuvik and Adigan, mostly marginal VFR at times. May see some improvement during the afternoon, but mostly a marginal day coming up for Sunday. Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR, either approach through the day Sunday, but rainy. Could see some marginal VFR at times the entire day, as will windy. And Isabel as well. Looks pretty marginal for Isabel Pass, and for Mentasta. Better chance of seeing some IFR there on the northern side of the mountains, otherwise marginal VFR. Tanita, marginal VFR becomes VFR at some point in the morning tomorrow through the afternoon. And Portage, VFR. Chilcoot White, IFR. Looking at the freezing levels, warmer air out west now, 2,000 feet up across the central Bering Sea right to the Russian coast, and then about 4,000 feet, 6,000 feet in over the west central Aleutians, and 2,000 feet south of Kodiak Island, now coming up to the eastern North Gulf coastal areas. And for the icing potential, of course, with that front coming eastward out over the Bering Sea, look for some isolated moderate rime icing associated with that in advance of the front, mostly over the central Aleutians, staying west of the Pribilofs, well west of the Pribilofs. And then also the moisture into the Panhandle. Look for some areas of isolated moderate rime icing there as well, up along the eastern North Gulf coast, eastern Copper River Basin, into the upper Tanana Valley. Otherwise icing free the remainder of the state. And for the jet stream, northeast winds 80 knots there across the Chukchi Sea. Turn northwest 80 to 100 knots down along the southwest coast, especially across the Alaska Peninsula. 90-knot westerlies out over the west central Aleutians. And at 9,000 feet, northeast winds 40 to 45 knots over the central and northern interior of the state, turning northerly at 45 across the Aleutian Range. Lighter for the Panhandle, and southwest 50 to 55 knots in across the central Aleutians. And 3,000 feet east, 45 knots there across the DeLong Mountains and along the northwest coast. 40-knot northerlies right down Cook Inlet to the Barren Islands. And with that, we've got widespread moderate turbulence over interior Alaska and the Alaska Peninsula, as well as Adak and Atka, Prince William Sound, and Cook Inlet.
Dual polarization technology is a major upgrade to the current radar system. It allows forecasters a better idea of what's actually out there and can help keep you safe.
Current radar technology transmits and receives information in the horizontal direction, which is very limited. Dual polarization technology, in addition to the horizontal, transmits and receives vertical energy, which allows forecasters to get information about the size, shape, and phase of the precipitation. We can use that information to better determine the precipitation type to expect at your given location.
There you have it. This new technology is currently being installed in radars across the country and is already being used by National Weather Service forecasters to produce better, more accurate forecasts. Learn more here and follow us. Want to know about the future of weather radar? Well, the National Severe Storms Lab has it here with its new phased array radar. Let's check it out.
It's a non-moving radar. It has 4 faces of the antenna, each pointing in different directions. One of the big advantages is that we're seeing so far, it can sample the area around the radar in less than a minute, maybe even a half a minute. And this is 5-6 times faster than what they can do today.
NSSL is leading the development of future weather radar with this project. Learn more here and follow us. The Storm Prediction Center is one of the NOAA weather partners. They are located in the National Weather Center in Norman, Oklahoma. Greg Carbon gives us a glimpse into what the SPC does.
Our mission is to analyze and forecast severe thunderstorms and the potential for tornadoes, large hail, and damaging winds from those thunderstorms across the lower 48 states, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. One of the primary missions of the Storm Prediction Center is the issuance of severe thunderstorm and tornado watches across the country when conditions appear to be coming together to support the development of severe thunderstorms and tornadoes.
The world-class meteorologists in the Storm Prediction Center specialize in severe weather and keeping you safe. Learn more here and follow us.
The National Severe Storms Lab is working on increasing the lead time for severe weather warnings. The national average for tornado warnings is currently 13 minutes, but more notice would be helpful, especially for those in charge of moving large groups to shelter. Warn on Forecast will help forecasters issue hazardous weather warnings earlier. The project will give them more info about the chances of strong winds, large hail, and even tornadoes.
Currently, warnings are created by forecasters looking at the atmosphere outside, understanding its volatility, and then comparing that to how they see the Doppler radar presenting what's going on inside thunderstorms. Warn on Forecast is an idea where we're going to take the massive amounts of satellite, radar, and surface data and stick them all into a very high-resolution prediction model. And then by producing new forecasts every 15 or 20 minutes, the forecasters hopefully will be able to use that model to produce warnings that extend out to an hour.
Before the National Weather Service can use this tool, it must be developed and tested. One big challenge will be deciding how to get the model predictions to the forecasters.
I'm going to keep this one very low. I'm just adjusting the track.
These hazardous weather prediction models are going to produce a huge amount of output. And this fire hose of data is just too much for forecasters to handle in real time quickly. So in order to help deal with that, NSSL has developed a related project called Facets. And Facets is the methodology which will enable forecasters to focus very quickly on the most important threats.
Once Warn on Forecast and Facets are proven to be reliable and effective, then forecasters will be better able to inform you of threats nearby. Learn more here and follow us.
The Hazardous Weather Test Bed is located at the National Weather Center in Norman, Oklahoma. It is used for experiments that will allow forecasters to learn and apply new technologies.
The Hazardous Weather Test Bed is a really unique space throughout all of NOAA. And this is where the researchers and the operational folks come together in a common space to solve operational problems and to test new research tools that the research community is working on. The goal is to accelerate the transfer from research to operations of the newest tools and techniques.
People come from around the world to collaborate on this unique project.
And we can bring together not only NOAA people, but also university people, faculty, researchers, private sector meteorologists, folks working in other countries in meteorology, forecasters can all come together and focus on what the problem of the day is with the forecasters.
Each spring, several experiments occur in the hazardous weather test bed. Learn more here and follow us.
What are you looking at? And what are you ignoring? Did you notice the NOAA logo in the corner? Forecasters have a lot of information in front of them too. Every second counts during severe weather, and decisions about where to focus are constantly being made. This could be even more challenging in the future. Phased array radar will produce 4 to 6 times more information than what we have now, which brings us to the question researchers are hoping to answer. Will more radar information affect forecasters' decisions?
From our past experiments, we've learned a lot about how forecasters think during the warning decision process, but we've also learned that those thought processes are very complex, and for that reason, we need a better way to be able to track forecasters' cognitive activity.
Inbounds and possibly golf ball-sized hail.
And eye tracker is a piece of technology that is used to determine in real time where someone's eye gaze is located. And these eye trackers are typically video-based, which means a camera sits below a computer monitor, and with infrared light and vector analysis, we can determine where a person is looking and how their eyes are moving.
Eye tracking is already being used in the medical field and air traffic control. Using similar research methods, NSSL is discovering the benefit for weather forecasting too. Phased array radar will give forecasters a lot more to think about. Understanding their decision-making process will help researchers develop even more user-friendly tools. So what's the benefit for you? Even better weather warnings. To learn more, check us out online and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And on to the coastal water forecast for the south coast, the Panhandle. Southeast winds 15 knots, and the north coast, east-southeast winds at about 15 knots. For the inside waters, Stevens Passage north winds at 10 knots, and Clarence Strait looking at a southeast wind at 15 knots for the day Sunday, and Lynn Canal variable to northeast. Pretty light at 10 knots, seas maybe 3 feet. And for Monday, Lynn Canal, southeast winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. South winds 20 knots for Clarence Strait with 4-foot seas, and south winds 20 knots also for Stevens Passage. And along the central and south coast, looking at south winds at 20 knots with 8-foot seas, and east-southeast winds 20 knots, 7-foot seas for the north coast. Moving over to Prince William Sound, small craft advisories for Sunday. Northeast winds 25 knots, seas at about 4 feet, and northeast winds 20 to 25 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Western North Gulf Coast, north winds at 25 knots. And we've got gale warnings out for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay for northwest winds at 35 knots. And seas running 8 to 10 feet. Cook Inlet, small craft advisories, north to northeast winds 30 knots, seas as high as 7 feet. And then for Monday, Cook Inlet, winds coming down to 15 knots from the northeast with seas subsiding to 3 to 4 feet. Prince William Sound, east winds 15 knots. Eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds at 20 to 25 knots. East winds 20 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. And north winds at 25 knots for Kamishak Bay. Barren Islands looking at a northwest wind at 30. Kodiak Island, northwest winds 30 knots for the day Sunday. And the Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 15 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, north winds at 20. And for Monday, Bristol Bay, lighter winds out of the east at 15 knots. Alaska Peninsula, south to southwest winds 20 to 30 knots with 2 to 8-foot seas. And Kodiak Island, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, seas 5 to 6 feet. For the eastern Aleutians, looking at northwest winds 15 to 25 knots, and for the central Aleutians, south to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots, western Aleutians, south winds 30 knots, seas 14 to 17 feet. And for Monday, eastern Aleutians, west-southwest winds 30 to 35 knots, west 25 knots for Adak and Atka. And for the western Aleutians, west-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. For the southwest coast, north winds 20 to 25 knots on Sunday. Light variable winds for the Pribilofs, northeast at 15 for St. Matthew Island. And for St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds at 20 knots, and brisk wind advisories out for Norton Sound for northeast winds at 25 knots. And even a little stronger winds in store for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island on Monday, both looking at brisk wind advisories for northeast winds at 30 knots. And for the southwest coast, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Small craft advisories for the Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island for north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the eastern Arctic coast, north to west winds at 15 to 20 knots. Central coast, north at about 15, but brisk wind advisories for the western Arctic coast, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And then for the day on Monday, brisk wind advisories still for portions of the western Arctic coast, mostly northeast 20 to 30 knots though. Central coast north at 10, and for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, pretty light variable winds at about 5 knots. From Wales to Cape Thompson, look for northeast winds at 20 knots. And for tonight, strong high pressure, Arctic high pressure, builds in over the north slope for pretty light winds, getting a little breezy possibly on the western Arctic coast, but more of a gradient through the Brooks Range, keeping those gusty northeast winds blowing through the passes of the mountains up there. And still pretty breezy over the eastern interior there, all the way down to the Copper River Basin, especially the eastern Alaska Range. Chance of snow and snow showers continues in those areas, with the winter weather advisories out for much of the eastern interior north of the Alaska Range to the southern Brooks Range. And showers for the Panhandle, cloudy skies, and a weakening front brings rain into Adak with a little bit of an increase in the winds. Otherwise, eastern Bering Sea staying pretty nice through Sunday. Wet for the central Aleutians, showers for the Panhandle. Still a chance of snow southeast interior with cold temperatures and gusty northeast winds across much of the interior. And less wind.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.